let me read you, my fellow Richard, a quote that went over the transom quite recently in an appearance on Amazon. I'm quoting in this case from Ben Burgess at Jacobin. In an appearance on the Rachel Maddow show on Monday, Kamala Harris called Donald Trump a tyrant. That's not new. And after all, it's certainly a defensible comment, but that's me talking, not Ben Burgess. But and then she followed it up, though, with a rather bizarre statement. Kamala Harris said, and I quote, "We used to compare the strength of our democracy to communist dictators. That's what we're dealing with right now in Donald Trump. And these titans of industry are not speaking up!" Exclamation point. Which is such an ideologically packed three sentences. It would take us a little while to parse it all out. But before I do, let me add another quote. Gavin Newsom, governor of California, just in case we think this is an aberration of some kind, and there are at least two aberrations if that's the case. Gavin Newsom, another presidential hopeful for the Democratic Party in 2028, said on Kara Swisher's podcast, in speaking about Zohran Mamdani, the Democratic nominee for mayor in New York, Newsom said, and I quote, "It sounds like Trump's been paying a lot of attention to Mr. Mamdani, given Trump's, quote, desire to socialize great American companies." According to Newsom, it is, quote, and again, I'm getting this from Ben Burgess in Jacobin, it is, quote, "just perverse," unquote, that someone like Mamdani could be, quote, "shaping the Democratic Party in the context of the socialist brand," end quote, when Trump is, quote, "the leading nationalist and socialist of our time." What the hell? What's your take on that?
Well, frankly, I'm disgusted. I did think, which is my failing, that these kinds of Cold War mentalities, which were not helpful then, would be fading with much else from the Cold War that has faded. And I'm disappointed that in the case of leading centrist Democrats like Kamala Harris, like Governor Newsom, I'm wrong. They are holding on to these ways of thinking and speaking as if nothing had ever changed, as if we were literally 40 years ago when that kind of talk was acceptable because people only were interested in demonizing socialism and communism, not in interrogating them, not in finding out whether there's an idea there, one or two, that might be interesting, whether there's an argument that you could learn from. Oh, no, 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 no. These deep minds don't need to look and learn. They already know and can dismiss with the wave of a hand. Dictatorship, Kamala Harris could have said, is something that goes with Donald Trump, and we would have kind of known what she meant. He himself enjoys playing with the term, so it would have been understood. What does the word communist add to the noun dictator that you're comparing him to? Really? A communist? Do you have any idea what the word communist even means? And the answer is no, of course not. She's right to hearken back to what we used to do. But she ought to be in a hurry to not do what we used to do. Doing used to do politics is why she lost. Doing used to do politics is why the Democratic Party is in the miserable condition it is now. Its only hope for the future being in the slogan, "We're not as bad as the other one."
And I was texting this morning with a friend of mine, a historian, and was not on the record, so I won't name him, but he said, quite rightly, every time I think the Democrats can't disappoint me more, they do. And in this case, what's astonishing to me about it is that both Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom are supposed to represent newer, fresher faces in the Democratic Party, right? They're not Joe Biden's generation. They're not Bernie Sanders' generation. They're the new and exciting strains in the party. And yet I feel like I'm 8 years old, and my dad brought me to a Rotarian luncheon or something in 1962. I just can't believe this stuff. And it also seems to me like, leaving aside the intellectual poverty, and they're trying to jerk, and they're trying to play knee-jerk politics with knees that haven't jerked that way for 40 years. What's stunning about it to me is that the one thing a politician should be able to do in this effed up system we operate in is read a goddamn poll. And if anybody who can read, any Democratic politician who can read a poll, knows that socialism is more popular than capitalism in their core, under 35 demographic, number one, and that it's not loathed overall among their voters as a whole. So why gratuitously alienate them and at the same time demonstrate an utter ignorance of the political science here? Because the fact is, what they're really defending is, if, for example, the economist Mariana Mazzucato did a nice graphic show of the iPhone showing how much of the technology had been created at public expense. What they're for is investing public money in creating technology that you then give to corporations to overcharge the public that created the technology for to use. And that to them is implicitly what they're defending, and that it's horrific and socialist to do something popular, and fair in most of our minds, which is, if we the people pay for it, we the people shouldn't have to pay for it twice, so some guy who didn't do it gets rich. Am I wrong about that?
No, no.
I mean, come on.
I'm not flabbergasted. I'm kind of used to it. I think the older generation that you refer to, Richard, was very careful in choosing, in the younger ones coming up, the yes men and the yes women who would replicate among the younger what they had done as the older. I mean, the gratuitous ignorance of Mr. Newsom to use socialism in that way. Is he in fact ignorant of what socialism? I'll pick one. That socialism in China is different from socialism in Sweden.
Right.
Really, which one do you mean? Or are you too ignorant to know that there's a difference, or too ignorant to care, or too ideologically anti-left to behave in this way? Italian socialism isn't the same as French, and on and on and on. What is he doing? Let me make just this
Sure.
point that I want to get out. I want to use the Chinese example. China refers to itself as socialism with Chinese characteristics. Well, here's one fact about Chinese socialism: that over the last 30 years or more, they have achieved an economic growth unprecedented in human history, on average each year 2 to 3 times faster than the United States. Wouldn't you imagine that a non-ideologically blinded governor would be able to say, we need to see what the Chinese have done and learn from them what we can, much as they could learn from us? The Chinese, by the way, talk all the time about learning from the United States. They're the first ones to say part of their growth in the last 30 years was because they made deals with American corporations to access the technology where they were behind and the Americans were ahead. So what's if they can do that there, what is it that blocks Mr. Why does he have to fight a Cold War battle with a country that, by the way, California needs more than most American states for the future? Why say such a thing? And by the way, since I'm in New York and I know what Mr. Mamdani is known for, it isn't about socializing ownership of big corporations. It's about rent freezing and creating small grocery stores and a whole host of policies Mr. Gavin Newsom either is ignorant of or needs to not rely. He's making something up about Mr. Mamdani because he wants to hit Mr. Mamdani for endorsing a concept of socialism that is Mr. Newsom's, not Mr. Mamdani's. But then again, Mr. Newsom doesn't know anything about socialism, so can't afford to talk about the different varieties, because if he did, he'd have nothing to say because his ignorance blocks him. It's when you look at it, it's a remarkable expose of what's lacking in him.
Well, it has stunned me to a certain extent. And the flip side of everything you've said, Rick Wolff, what I totally agree with, is that it also displays a frightening ignorance about dictatorships and totalitarianism at a time when we do need to be concerned about the totalitarian threat in this country. I am not one of those who think we were all that free to begin with, but bad things are happening. And if you think that that's got something to do with socialism, if you don't know who Adolf Hitler was, if you don't know who Ferdinand Marcos was, if you don't know who a whole string of the general in Uruguay or whoever, if you don't know how dictatorship arises, if you think it's only through Soviets being formed in Leningrad basements, then you don't understand a goddamn thing about the issue your party purports to fight. So you're incapable of resisting that threat. You're ineffectual, and your 23% popularity ratings are going to look like heaven to you a year from now.
Yeah, it is self-destructive politically, and it makes you wonder whether in the self-referential circles of the Democratic Party leadership, they haven't concluded that they're more in danger from the emerging socialist left than they are from the dictatorship of Mr. Trump, that they can get along better being the replacement for Trump when he flames out, and that they better be gearing up for that. And so that's why you see perhaps the focus on winning over the Trump MAGA supporters. They've given up. The left is pulling away from them, but the prognosis then is not good for them, because if the Democratic Party here is like the socialist parties of Europe, most of them are disappearing. They are losing to the left and right. The middle is disappearing, and the Democratic Party is now in this country occupying the middle, and it's disappearing on them, and they're very upset, and they are retreating into Cold War sloganeering because they can't deal with the reality that they confront.
They're also positioning themselves more aggressively than ever as the party of the status quo. And if there's one thing that there's almost universal consensus on in the electorate, it's that the status quo sucks.
Right.
Nobody likes the way things are right now. Why should they? And yet, what they're saying in effect is, we don't think anything needs to change. Now, in the same article, Ben Burgess's article in Jacobin, he points out that Bernie Sanders, among others, is talking about this as reasonable. He quotes Bernie as saying, "quote If microchips make a profit from the generous grants they receive from the federal government, then the public as a whole has a right to a reasonable return on the investment." Something I'm sure you, as well as I, have been saying for quite some time. But Trump is as anti-socialist as one can imagine, trying to crush unions, trying to push, these minor departures from so-called free market ideology are in pursuit of short-term goals. And if anything, most people will look at that and say, yeah, why not? We should have a piece of that. Or, yeah, if we're going to, I do, frankly.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's something I could go to my old neighborhood in or anywhere in this country. And, I've been trying to make that case for years anyway. If we do it, we should have a piece of it. And if we're going to bail out your company that you effed up, Boeing CEO or Chase CEO, then we're going to take it over. This to me is common sense. And if anything, it just reinforces the sense that, what's the old song? Whatever it is, I'm against it. That Groucho Marx's song, that if Trump does it, they're against it. But Trump's not really doing it, is he?
No. Taking seriously Mr. Trump on any given day is a fool's errand. All it means is 2 days later, you're going to look stupid because you took seriously what he was willing to jettison, at a moment's notice if something better or different came across his desk to do. It's just, it's craziness. By the way, if you know anything about socialism, you'll know that socialists, among others, have long debated what it does and does not accomplish to have workers owning a share of the stocks or the government owning. That's a debate. That's not a settled matter one way or the other. The nuanced treatments talk about the conditions under which it is done as having a lot to do with what the consequences are, etc., etc., etc. I find it charming, that's all, that the enemy of China should be trying to fight the Chinese better by having state owned and operated enterprises, when the ideology of the United States was to characterize China as a failure because of the state and we as a success because of the private. And then our president has to rescue a failing private by making it a state. I mean, the admission of the nonsense of your ideology is buried right there. But of course, that's lost on the people like Gavin Newsom, because for him, in his mind-bendingly ignorant notion of socialism, if you take over something as the state, gee, you got socialism. He ought to end the post office. He ought to end half a dozen other bad things that he is the governor of, because my goodness, the state of California shouldn't be doing something. It should be doing as little as possible, or else it's like communist, and Kamala Harris will be a down on it. It's really.
Well, it's funny. I had a very similar thought as we were speaking, which was, I'm glad these people weren't around in the 1930s when they were creating Social Security, because they would have said it's communism. Whereas FDR, as you know, took credit for saving capitalism. We could talk about what kind of distinction that is, but certainly he was not a socialist or communist in his own identification, but they would have called him that, I assume, and opposed him. In fact, this rhetoric I've written on the anti-Social Security rhetoric of the 1930s, very similar to what Harris and Newsom are saying. I'm glad they weren't around in the 1960s when LBJ was, for all of his flaws, creating Medicare, because I'm sure they would have said the same thing about that. And it strikes me as, as if you're, well, let's do this. Let's talk about China for a second, because China is the bête noire of our current political system, right? It is everybody in politics likes to beat up on China, except Trump, who likes to beat up on them and maybe do a deal here or there. Yeah. So now, because of the hysteria that Joe Biden and his people ginned up over ownership of TikTok and the possibility of China's government manipulating that data, now Larry Ellison is going to own it. Right wing, Trump supporting billionaire is going to control the algorithm on TikTok. Elon Musk controls the algorithm on X. Mark Zuckerberg controls the algorithm on Facebook. That's freedom. I mean, that's so, and a lot of that is because of fear of China. But I'm not an expert on the Chinese economy by any means. Yeah, I studied it in college, but it was a very different economy in the 1970s than it is today. And it seems to me that there are segments of the Chinese economy that are almost Keynesian in their construction. It's a regulated capitalist formation. There are other state-owned businesses and so on, directed foreign investments, but it's a complex, multifaceted model. Now, do they have electoral democracy? No, I don't believe they do. But and I'm not an expert on their political system either. But it seems to me that to stereotype the Chinese system and to assume, for example, that it resembles Bolshevism in 1919, let's say, or Albanian socialism under Enver Hoxha or what have you, it seems to me as just cartoon thinking, is just, spy versus spy, the spy in the black outfit, the spy in the white outfit. I don't get, I would think they would want to learn from all these models. Hey, did that work? Did that not work? Hey, we tried Milton Friedman style deregulation. How'd that work out? Well, not so great. Oh, well, what about the Keynesian thing? How'd that work? Well, good here, not so good here. You'd think they'd want to do that, but that's not happening.
Well, when I was a graduate student at Yale years ago, there would be Eastern Europeans from what was then communist countries, Russians and others, who would visit Yale. They were professors of economics over there. And at the end of every one of these seminars, some of which I attended, it would be pointed out by somebody how interesting it was that they could comment on what we were doing. We could comment on what they were doing. They were doing really interesting work that in those days in what was called linear programming, a way of doing planning in economics. And it became clear that the problems they had planning the development of their electric industry or steel industry were very similar to the planning being done by U.S. Steel and the other private enterprises, which by that time was so big in the United States that they weren't that different from the governmental ministries that had their, so the responsibility had a different title, but the planning mechanism, they could teach each other. They had solved certain kinds of arithmetic problems. We in the America had done another. So there was a way of learning, and it was done automatically and naturally, and everybody walked away feeling they had gotten something out of the seminar that did that. And I remember once one of them saying, too bad our political leaders can't do more or less the same thing. Yeah, so your idea is of course right. But I think Harris and Newsom, that's the old mentality. They are the old politicians. They may have a new, younger body, but they're the old politicians with the old ideas. They were raised in the mentality of the Cold War, and they're not going to give it up. And just like the Democratic Party became the party of its donors years ago, and therefore less and less different from the Republicans, which lost them the working class vote, or a large part of it, uh, they are now also responding to their donors. They want their donors. They want the donors that will no longer go with the Republicans, because the Republicans are leaving their ideology because they've got unspeakable problems to solve. They don't know how to do it. You know, Mr. Trump says part of why I'm taking over Intel is for national security. And when they poked him, what does that mean? He points out correctly, which, by the way, the Democrats never want to talk about, that the national debt of the United States is $37 trillion. That has risen over the last 30 to 40 years faster than anything else. The stock market, prices, it's off the chart. It's therefore a credit laden economic system, and the government is leading the way, and the government is becoming an untrustworthy borrower. And the creditors of the world are looking at this and saying, I'm not lending anymore to you. Liz Truss lost her prime ministership of Britain after a few weeks because she tried to borrow a lot of money, and the capital markets in her city of London, told her, we're not doing that. You're not going to get that money, and that's going to make you look really bad. So you really want to go through with it. She withdrew, and they threw her out. I don't think Mr. Trump wants to get himself, so he has to wholesale cut government spending and come up with a tax to replenish the government's money so it doesn't have to borrow so much. And the long-term effects, both of firing large numbers of federal workers and of whacking the world with a tariff, he doesn't have the time or the space to deal with that problem. He's doing triage. He's dealing with the faltering American economy, and he's desperate about doing it. And that's why he does what he does. But the Democrats can't do an analysis like that, because if you do, it leads back to, well, why are we in this problem? And the answer is our capitalists decided in the 1970s to leave in huge numbers. And they took their industries with them and went to China and Brazil and India. And you're dealing with the fallout, but you're never able to point to the finger of what the problem is. Profit-driven capitalism works that way. It's like I'm in New England, right? We're in New England. New England was the center of capitalism until the capitalists moved to the Midwest. Then the capitalists moved again, so we call it the Rust Belt. It's as if these were, climatic changes of weather.
Right.
And you just have to watch. And there's nobody who made a decision to do it. But there are. There are. And now he wonders, he wants them all to come back. And they're telling him, we're not doing that. We're not doing that. And they're not. The few that come back for high tech. And the one interesting thing about high tech when they come back is that they don't hire very many people, because high tech is about engineers and lots of computers. That doesn't deal with the American economic problem, doesn't begin to.
In a way, it can exacerbate it both in terms of inequality and in terms of fossil fuel consumption, for sure. So, the environmental impacts are significant. So all this points to, and maybe this is a topic we should be, we should ponder more. But all this points to a system on the verge of, I don't know if collapse is the right word, a decline. Those are quantifications of time, like time measurements, I guess, whether it's rapid, slow, whatever. But it seems to me a system that's running out of options or has run out of options, with a political process that does not offer a chance to peacefully opt for something different. And that to me does not look very good for the future, because that to me says, well, are we just going to wait till things go to hell and then, or continue to get worse? They're going to hell. And, economically, in terms of people's well-being, in terms of people's health, in terms of the environment, in terms of political frustration, civil divisions, and so on, are we just going to keep sliding down this hill until some big thing happens? And what is that?
Yeah, and having our leading politicians in the Democratic Party using tired, old, empty, ignorant language of the Cold War when there isn't a Cold War. What a pathetic response to the crises of our time. I mean, they make fun of Mr. Trump, but their behavior invites exactly the same.
Well, and I would argue that Trump is the product of a system that has satisfied itself or, accepted as tolerable politicians like Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom. You throw up enough folks like that for long enough, you're going to get a Trump of some kind or another. That's my theory.
Yeah. That's been the story of the past as well.
We depend on your support here at the 0 Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.